Story 1. The Phone. Let me start by saying I have an unusual name. I've only met maybe 3 other people in my life with the same name. The last 2 years of high school, I was homeschooled. My parents and I had moved into the mountains. A big old spooky house. Out in the middle of nowhere. On a farm. It was pretty isolating. I missed my friends from the city. My best friend, to this day, had also decided to homeschool, and he spent most of his junior and senior year living at our house with us. One night, he was actually spending time at his own home back in town, so we decided to do whatever we usually do, but over the phone. You know, we were playing on the Xbox 360 and the PC. It was like 3 a.m. I was alone upstairs. The conversation was quiet. When I hear his mom say my name, I waited for a moment thinking, why did his mom pick up the phone and say my name at 3 a.m? And then my friend says, "Are you going to talk to your mom?" I responded with, "That wasn't my mom, dude. She's asleep." So he goes and walks into his mom's room. She's fast asleep. I get spooked, get up real fast, get off the phone, and run to my parents' room. Sure enough, my mom and my dad are both sound asleep. The phone is on the hook across the room from where they're asleep. I wake my mom up frantically by shaking her, and I ask, "Did you pick up the phone and say my name just a minute ago?" Of course she didn't. I run back upstairs, call my friend, tell him what just happened. He's freaked out too. I end up sleeping with my parents that night. No regrets. It spooked me. Story 2. Mr. Meyer's Ghost. When I was about 5 years old, my family moved to northern Michigan. Coming from the suburbs of Chicago, the wide open fields and forests were an exciting change for us. We moved into a 4-bedroom colonial on 10 acres. The place had been empty for at least a year before our move. Something about the upstairs of the house never sat well with us. I would never go up there alone. I always made my older sister go with me. There were 4 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs. My sister and I each had our own room. My parents shared the primary suite, and my aunt and cousin lived in the guest room for a while. I always had to sleep with the nightlight on, until I was probably 10 years old. I would usually fall asleep in my parents' room, and then they would carry me to my bed. One night when I was about 6, I'd woke up from a sound sleep, paralyzed with fear. I made myself look in the doorway, where I felt someone watching me. I saw a black outline of a tall man watching me from the door. He was totally opaque and he didn't move. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. I put the covers over my head until I got enough courage to fly out of my bed and run to my parents' room. My parents were very understanding, and they were, even when it happened several more times. When I got older, 9 or 10, the pervasive feeling of terror I had at night started to lessen. I was still never totally comfortable in that house. Last summer, when I came home from college, it was to a completely different house. My parents had moved. My parents, my sister, my aunt, and I started talking about the old house. It turns out about once a month, my parents would waken out of a sound sleep by what sounded like work boots tromping up and down the hallway. At first, they thought it was my sister sleepwalking, but when they went to check on us, we'd be sound asleep in our beds. My aunt also heard the footsteps. My sister said on some nights she would wake up and see a white mist in her room. My parents never told us the stories while we lived in the house, not wanting to scare my sister or me. My dad said that he told our neighbor at the time about the noises, and the neighbor told him the history of the house. 100 years ago, a farm set where our house was, and had burned down in a horrible fire. The neighbor said that the old farmer who lived there, Mr. Myers, had died in the fire. I remember when we was planting some trees around the house. We dug up some old bricks. So maybe there's some truth to the story the neighbor told. All I know is that after we moved from the house, I've never had a difficult time falling asleep. And I've never felt like someone was watching me. Story 3. The Graveyard. My dad was in the military, and he was stationed in Tennessee. He and some of his friends were clowning around at an old graveyard. It was old and not very well cared for. Some of the graves were sunken in, and some were shallow enough that there were holes from the final collapse of the coffin. Dad and his friends got a little rowdy, and something in the graveyard didn't like it. Dad said they could hear this growling that sounded like it was getting louder and louder, coming from all directions. These guys wasn't going to wait around for something to happen, so they took off like the devil himself was on their heels. And the very second they crossed the threshold of the cemetery, the growling stopped. My family is prone to strange things happening. My grandma predicted my grandfather's death. She had a dream that my grandfather, my dad, and one of my uncles went over a hill. It was close to dinner time, so she called them back. My dad and my uncle came back, but when she called her grandpa, he said he wasn't coming back. No more than 2 weeks after the dream, Grandpa had a heart attack at the dinner table and died before the paramedics could arrive. She didn't dream about him again until 19 years later, when she started dreaming about him again. Shortly after, she went to join him. Story 4. The Phantom. My mother told me that ghosts were made up by people a long time ago, and I believed it until I stayed the night at my neighbor's house just up the street. The Smiths had a beautiful colonial-style house that dated back to the 1700s. I guess a lot of events have happened there over the years. The Smiths' house had originally been the servants' quarters for the main house that sat across the street. One day, in the late 1800s, a man named Edward was working in the barn on a piece of machinery when he suddenly lost control. His arm got caught inside, and it was tore off. For hours he laid there in the barn bleeding and crying out for help. But no one found him until it was too late. Supposedly, he haunts the Smiths' home. So now, for my story. It was around 1987, and I was 6 years old, but I was well aware of my surroundings. My parents were going on vacation, and my sister and I were to stay at the Smiths' house. It was especially crowded this particular night because they had relatives visiting from another state. At about 5 o'clock, we all had dinner. Afterwards, we all played like little kids do. And finally, we all got together to settle down and go to sleep. Since there was a lack of rooms, one of the Smith's sons, John, and I slept in the attic. Their attic wasn't the typical spooky attic. One half had been converted into a room, and the other half was used for storage. John and I settled on the floor in our sleeping bags, and after about 10 minutes, we were fast asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Forgetting where I was, I looked around the room until I realized where I was sleeping. Slowly, I looked to the right to see if John was asleep. Of course he was. Then I looked to the doorway, to the other half of the attic, and what I saw I will never forget. In the darkness, there was a dark figure with an incredibly light face, crouching down in the doorway. The face was so white it looked like a mask. It looked like his head was floating there without a body. I became so frightened I couldn't move. The only movements that the figure made were the blinking of his eyes. Suddenly I threw the blankets over my head, and I screamed for help while I cried uncontrollably. It must have been 10 minutes before Mrs. Smith ascended the attic stairs. In a rush to see what had startled me, I begged to go home, but of course I was stuck at the Smiths because my parents were out of town. Mrs. Smith's only resolution was to put me to sleep with my sister. So for the rest of the night, I slept safely with my sister. I'm not the only one who has seen things. Years later, Mrs. Smith confided that she has had many experiences with this entity. One night, while the rest of her family was away in Cape Cod, she got ready to go to sleep, but before falling asleep, she decided to read the rest of one of her books. While she was reading, she looked up at her bedroom door, and she saw it. There was a man in clothing that looked old-fashioned, standing in the doorway, just staring at her. Slowly, she got herself together and asked the man what he wanted. Without a word, he turned around and walked down the hallway, into a wall, and disappeared. This scared her out of her mind. She ran down the street into our house for some comfort. Another story about the Smith's house was told to me on accident by a girl named Jen, who lived just up the street from me. She told me that one Halloween, her sister, and her mother went trick-or-treating up the street. They reached the Smith's house. You'd always get excited about reaching the Smith's house because they put out the most frightening haunted houses. So Jen, her mother, and sister all went up to the Smith's front door. All the lights to the house were out, but the front door was wide open. Thinking this was part of the haunted house, they went inside. The living room was completely dark, and the house was silent. But within seconds, commotion began directly upstairs. Jen and her family heard ghostly laughter, whispering, crying. They were scared, the way you're scared on Halloween. But all that changed. Soon after, the ball they had heard bouncing, and a figure in the darkness fell down the stairway, screaming. The figure didn't just slide down the stairs. It was flipping over on its head, smashing itself into the banister. After its fall, the figure just lay there at the foot of the stairs, completely silent. Jen, her mother, and her sister all ran out of the house screaming, not knowing if what they saw was real or fake. But the next week, the Smiths got back from a trip they took to New Jersey. Apparently, they had been out of town for Halloween. The figure that family saw was not an elaborate Halloween prank. The hauntings still continue to this day, but they're not as extreme as they once were. Hopefully the ghost or ghosts will eventually move on into the afterlife. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the stories. If you did, hit the subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I really do appreciate it. Bye.